and I hand over the floor to Gonzalo.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you again. And here we are going to talk today, as you mentioned, about what was planned in the session on levels of consciousness and the development of the cognitive line. Let's see if you remember the previous session talking about the multidimensionality of the human being. We said that the human being had several bodies, and that within those bodies there had to be an information archive, because everything in life was energy plus information. And therefore, of course, there has to be an archive of information. So we talked about the genetic archive linked to the physical body. We talked about the archive of character and personality linked to the emotional and mental body. And we also talked about the third information archive, which is the archive called consciousness, so to speak, and which was linked to the spiritual body or soul. We also mentioned in the last session, we quoted Saint Basil of Caesarea, for example, within the Christian world, where it was stated that Earth, planet Earth, was a school for souls. And with the astronomical data we had, it's logical to suppose that there must be other planets in the universe that probably, or most probably, or that's what scientists say, will also be schools for souls. In other words, all physical life, what we call physical life. Well, they are pedagogical schools for the development of the soul. That's what we established in a way in the previous session. So, no, of course, people might wonder, well, just like in schools on Earth, we know that for a child to pass high school or whatever it is, what subjects do they need to pass? Well, whatever they are, physics, chemistry, mathematics, geography, I don't know, whatever they are in the programs. Well, we can look at the levels of consciousness, like the subject, the soul has to learn somehow or has to develop through in the schools for souls that are the physical planets. So these levels of consciousness are being investigated. I already mentioned in the first session that consciousness was one of the most important topics in science today, after quantum physics, because of what we talked about regarding quantum collapse and consciousness creating reality and such. They are studying consciousness. So we have to realize that we are here to develop our level of consciousness. The level of consciousness determines in a very profound way all the main aspects of our life. Before knowing about the existence of these levels of consciousness, we attributed it in some way to character or personality. But now we realize that the most important things in our life include our attitudes and behaviors, even the kind of temptations we experience. And we will see this more clearly in the following sessions on self-responsibility, depend on our level of consciousness. And it profoundly determines all the most important aspects of our life. Do not confuse, it sometimes happens, the dimensions we talked about with the levels of consciousness, because the dimensions are like new worlds of different vibrational frequency, and dimensions and levels of consciousness are the possible levels of consciousness we can have in the human realm, in the third dimension when we are here in the physical worlds. When we ascend in our level of consciousness, we obviously become more angelic and less animalistic, or less ego-driven and aggressive and more loving. We will see that too. And we must also say that as we talked about downward causation, if you remember in the first session, the levels of consciousness impact us significantly because they even determine, for example, how the brain functions. Notice that this is something we can all easily observe. When levels of consciousness are lower, the soul is less developed and holds less information, so to speak. So people's behavior is much more reactive. And why is that? Because we talked about the 3 layers of the brain in previous sessions, and people with a lower level of consciousness really are not guilty of having it. Just like a small child is not yet guilty of mischief because they are 3 years old and are still being educated. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. And for example, low levels of consciousness, external impulses, right? They go more directly to the reptilian brain, right? The neocortex is not yet so energized. It's not that it cannot be used or that people cannot reason, but it doesn't yet govern their lives as much. And notice that even in some of my lectures elsewhere, I have sometimes said, hey, if we can pass by the cars on the street and insult each passing car or flip them off and such, how much percentage of people do you think will react to us? And in some magical or miraculous way, it turns out that people always answer 90% as if they knew intuitively. There is a small percentage of people who would not react to us insulting them or flipping them off when their car passes by or whatever it may be. Can you imagine Mother Teresa reacting to us because we insult her as her car goes by? No. Now, can you perfectly imagine Capone getting out of the car and shooting you? So this is how it is, and people intuitively understand it. What we are going to try in this session is to explain this a bit more rationally so that this intuition we all have is a bit more organized in our heads, so to speak. So notice that brain function changes with different levels of consciousness. And this is what matters. Let's see, the scientific fact is that people from the moment of birth already have a soul with a different level of consciousness. I don't know if I'm explaining it right. Since he was a child, Al Capone wanted to steal toys from his classmate, and since she was a child, Mother Teresa knew she had to dedicate herself to what she devoted herself to later, because I had the fortune of being able to have a meeting with her many years ago, more than 30 years ago in New York, on a matter that she needed help with and such. And I asked her, hey, have you never had the inclination to be a normal woman? Get married, start a family. Since when have you had this vocation? And I remember being very impacted when she told me, no, since I was a girl, I've known that I cannot limit my love to so few people. Notice her response. And that impacted me at that moment when I also did not have a great understanding or spiritual development, but that was obvious. And notice that Teresa of Calcutta was born in Albania in a very complicated environment, but the level of consciousness was decisive, and she always was who she was. Just to give an example, this has happened with many other people, of course, which is why now it is known that from the moment of a human being's birth, that person's soul has a level of consciousness different from other souls that are also born. And that should lead us to ask ourselves, where does that level of consciousness come from? Because some souls, just like people, are born with a different intelligence quotient than others, or with a different memory capacity than others. But that is in the archive of character and personality that is linked to the mind. So now we know that people are born with different levels of consciousness. And that is how we will explain now, because of course, in all the schools on earth, we have students in nursery, middle, high school, and pre-university. And of course, those in preschool are playing with clay, and those in pre-university will already be dealing with algebra on the board. Of course, it would be just as bad. Put algebra in front of preschoolers who will not understand anything, and it will frustrate everyone, just as it would be bad if the pre-university students were playing with clay. At each level, each possibility requires specific learning processes for that level, right? So this is important to understand because that is a fact, right? And now what we have to do is interpret the fact. That is, what does it mean that souls come with different levels of consciousness? And then where does that come from? Notice how I really like reading Saint Augustine, because I think he is right about almost everything, despite living many years ago. I am going to read what he says about it. Saint Augustine says, there are 4 opinions about the origin of the soul, namely that it is transmitted through generations, or that it is formed individually in each of those who are born. The one about persistence in some place from which they are sent by God to the bodies. And the one that says they spontaneously come from that place. But it says more, it says that it is advisable not to affirm any of these options lightly, because the Catholic commentators of the holy books, undoubtedly due to their darkness and perplexity with this topic, they have not yet unraveled and clarified this issue. He says, or if they have already done so, their writings have not yet reached my hands. So as you see, Saint Augustine already pointed out different possibilities about the pre-existence of the soul and wondered which one of them would be the case. What is clear, it seems, from the data is that one of 2 things: either God creates the soul at different levels of information and wisdom, and then they have one opportunity here on earth to continue growing, just one opportunity. And then after that, we know they continue growing spiritually or purifying themselves, that's the word, in purgatory or in worlds of other dimensions or whatever. But of course, there is a very famous spiritual saying that all traditions agree with, which says, as above, so below. Here on earth, we observe that children are all born equal as babies, with character and personality undeveloped, and then through life, they develop at least on a mental and emotional level. Well, on a spiritual level, logically, the logical thing would be to think that God creates the souls, because spirituality is transrational, but never irrational. So that God creates the souls innocent without information, and they gather information throughout a series of experiences, which can be in these dimensions or in others over time, right? To go from the animalistic up to, let's say, angelic, which is the evolution of consciousness of the souls. That is what salvation really consists of, in my opinion. That is evolving in consciousness through these levels that already existed before human beings existed. These are levels of consciousness of all of God's creatures. They have to, in some way, progress or move through them. Therefore, each person can interpret it however they want. But what is clear is that the soul comes with a pre-existing level of consciousness. That is a fact. And it is also clear that after death, the soul continues to evolve through those levels. And I insist, those who believe in reincarnation will think that it is by returning to other bodies in the physical world, like the Orientals. Westerners believe that it is in other dimensions, which we call purgatory or whatever, where souls continue. But they all agree on this, that after death, the soul continues to evolve, as shown today by the souls, studies of near-death experiences, psychiatric relations, and many other issues. Thus, we have to know that we are all here working on our spiritual evolution to be able to increase our levels of consciousness according to those levels that are already pre-established in some way. We also have to say that there is a mathematical equation, and I explain this specifically about the levels of consciousness in more detail in the first book than in the second. In the second, it is mentioned but not developed in as much detail as in the first. But we also know from the research that has been done that our happiness, as we will see in more detail in the 5th or 6th session, our happiness depends more, or rather, it depends entirely on the level of consciousness. I mean, there is a mathematical equation that says happiness equals level of consciousness. In low levels of consciousness, there is no happiness. There is a lot of conflict, trouble, commotion. Let me explain. The internal conflict is the gnashing of teeth that Jesus spoke of. And in high levels, there is already a lot of happiness. I have a chart in the first book that describes it level by level and percentage of happiness. But you must be clear with this idea. If we want to be happy, better than having success, better than having health, better than anything, is to raise our level of consciousness. And that will lead us to be happier automatically. In other words, Mother Teresa or Gandhi, because this does not depend on any denomination, but rather on the purity of intention of each person. They were happier than Al Capone or Pablo Escobar, regardless of success or lack thereof, resources or no resources, health or no health. It was their way of interpreting and understanding the world that leads you to that inner peace and happiness. So if it seems good to you, you can notice that in my first book, I present two scales of levels of consciousness, one more detailed by Hawking, another summarized by Schmeling, but there are many more, right? And as always, this can be explained one way, another way, or 1,000 ways, but the central idea is always the same. There are levels of consciousness, and some are higher than others, evolutionarily speaking, because the universe is hierarchical in that sense. And we have to understand them, because I always say that when you have a map in front, it's easier to go on a journey because you will do it more efficiently. That is, for example, when we explain the levels of consciousness, everyone will find themselves recognized in one of them. And by knowing what the next one is and how it's experienced and what its characteristics are, I think it makes the journey easier. I'm not saying it determines it, but I do say it facilitates it. When I go on a trip with a map or with a GPS in the car, I have a less chance of taking the wrong way, of having to turn back, of going on the wrong road. So look, anything can be explained meter by meter, or centimeter by centimeter, or millimeter by millimeter. This is 1 meter, it is also 100 centimeters, it is also 1,000 millimeters. Therefore, we have to understand that the levels also have many sub-levels within them. But due to the time we have in the session, I will not give a more detailed explanation of the scale that is in the book. Perhaps in other conferences you can also find on YouTube that I have given on the subject. And today I am going to focus on what the levels of consciousness are, viewed meter by meter, to give us an idea. So look, researchers say, for example, in the case of Schmeling, it says on Earth, there are 3 levels of consciousness seen from meter to meter, just like in Earth schools. There are kindergarten, middle high school, and pre-university, and they are all in the same building. The thing is, each one is doing different things. Seen meter by meter, the lowest level found on Earth is what is called level 2. Level 1 existed, but it doesn't occur as much anymore. That level involved barbarians entering villages, eating children, and raping women. There was nor any respect at all for any sensitivity to the suffering of others. It was pure savagery. And they say that no longer exists on Earth because humanity, of course, is evolving. They say that now the lowest level, which is already low enough, is what they call level 2. So level 2 of consciousness, it has 3 basic characteristics, so to speak. The first basic characteristic is that the government systems are dictatorial, not democratic. The second is that conflicts are resolved through physical violence. If you have a problem, a conflict with Al Capone or Pablo Escobar, or God forgive me, maybe with Putin, instead of filing a lawsuit, he sends someone to shoot you. I don't know if I am making myself clear, right? In other words, conflicts between people are still resolved through physical violence. Furthermore, level 2 of consciousness does not produce much technology, right? They can buy it and use it, but they do not produce it themselves. Therefore, those are the 3 most important characteristics of level 2 consciousness. Researchers say that about 25% of humanity is at that level 2, right? Just like a percentage of students in any school are preschool students, right? So that 25% make a lot of noise. They're in the news all day, right? Well, who could we say are at level 2? Well, all those who use physical violence to solve problems. Drug traffickers, violent criminals, political dictators, or for example, terrorists, I don't know, of all kinds. People of level 2. And they are the ones who create all the problems for us, right? Notice that all of humanity's problems They are fundamentally due to low levels of consciousness, because if you think about it, when the level of consciousness is very low, there is a lot of aggression. There is war, there is violence. No one agrees with anyone. It is the law of the strongest. And of course, that always produces many inefficiencies. We are seeing it right now, aren't we? The war in Ukraine is raising the cost of oil, gas, or whatever for everyone. There are supply issues with food produced there or whatever. In short, anything that is a low level of consciousness creates inefficiencies, and that's why there are not enough resources for everyone. Once I was giving a lecture at the Faculty of Economics at the University of Granada, and during the Q&A session, the students asked me, why did I think there had been such a big economic crisis in Spain around the year 2012? And I remember I answered them like this. I said, can you tell me what you all think has been the cause before I give you my answers? And I remember some of them raised their hands and said, there has been a lot of corruption. And others said, there was a lot of excess debt. Another said, there was little long-term investment and a lot of speculative investment. And so they gave me 5 or 6 reasons, all of them valid, and all of them had happened. I remember I answered them. I said, okay, perfect. You have wonderfully identified the sub-causes, right? But I ask you another question. Do you believe that if all Spanish citizens had a level of awareness, like, for example, Mother Teresa or Gandhi, there would have been a lot of corruption? And everyone, no. And I tell them, hey, there would have been a lot of excess debt, and everyone, no. Of course, right? And so on for each of the sub-causes they mentioned, right? So I made them see, I somehow said, look, well, the main problem, it is not in the corruption, it is not in the excess of debt, but those are consequences of a low level of awareness among Spaniards that caused all of that to happen. I don't know if I am making myself clear, right? So that's why I say that the level of awareness or lack of it is the main cause of all human problems. And that's where it needs to be corrected. The rest is just putting on patches. I can chase corruption my whole life, but there will always be corruption. I can try to stop the entry of drugs into the United States, but it won't succeed. That will only be achieved when people stop consuming them. And then, when there isn't any demand, then there will be no supply. But trying to police everyone is practically impossible. And that is why many inefficiencies arise in societies. Obviously, it is a more advanced civilization. If everyone had a level of consciousness higher than Mother Teresa, obviously there are things we wouldn't need. For example, police, judges, armies, weapons, and so on. And how much money do we spend on all that? If all that money could be spent on education or on productive sectors of society, then of course the world would be different and there would be enough for everyone. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Then a low level of consciousness always produces inefficiency, because of course, who would build a factory in Syria or Ukraine only to have it bombed the next day? Well, nobody, right? Therefore, if there is no peace, right? If there is no trustworthiness and if there's no possibility of agreements, then everything that involves struggle and conflict always produces inefficiencies. That's obvious, isn't it? And the solution for humanity is to raise the level of consciousness so that this no longer happens, right? Well, then we had said that the lowest level was level 2. We had given the percentage of the population that is in it, and we had described its main characteristics, right? Well, now the next level of consciousness seen from meter to meter is what is called level 3 of consciousness, right? And what are the main characteristics of level 3? First, government systems are democratic. They are no longer dictatorial, right? The democratic system, it is not yet the best possible system, but it is much better than the, let's say, than the system dictatorial, obviously. It is still violent because it is the rule of the majority over the minority. many inefficiencies still occur because in addition, as it is one person, one vote, most people are at lower levels. Sometimes they vote for low-level people because they don't recognize the candidate's lack of level. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. So it still has many problems, but it is superior to, let's say, the dictatorial. And what are the other characteristics? Quite a bit of technology is already being produced at level 3. Of course, it's not the same to go to London or New York as it is to go to Yemen or Somalia. You are not going to find great Wi-Fi towers or modern airports or those things there. And the third characteristic, and this one is important, is that conflicts are no longer resolved by physical violence, but rather are resolved through verbal or mental violence. For example, we all see what happens in Congress in Spain when they show it on television, some sessions, and we already realize that no one punches another or throws a chair like what happened in Ukraine or Venezuela, which we have seen on television in parliament, where they have physically fought. Here, no. Here they insult each other, they disparage each other. They do not talk about serious problems. They say nonsense, cliches, slogans, but at least there is no physical violence anymore. And parliamentarians can return home safe and sound. Therefore, it seems that there has already been the first level of violence, which is physical violence, has already been overcome. However, the other two levels of violence, which are mental and verbal, continue. Then they say that 70% of the Earth's population is at level 3. Therefore, if Earth were seen from space, it would be defined as a level 3 school of souls, because that is where the center of gravity is. But it seems that in all schools of souls, because evolution is not only individual but collective, 3 levels always coexist, because it is what helps us grow more, apparently, according to God's plan. But of course, the lower levels serve as our trainers, right? And the higher levels serve as inspiration, as a model. And so that's why creation is made that way. Of course, if we see that in level 3, there are many sub-levels. It's not the same to be in the lower third than in the upper third. This is the big difference. In the lower third, although physical violence has already been abandoned, there is still no integrity. And if you can steal a bill and nobody sees you, you do it. Because the only ethical criterion there is not to get caught. We see it in politics every day. In the upper third, people already have their own ethical level. They are more integral. And what doesn't seem right to them, they don't do, period. Whether they get caught or not, right? Although people in the higher third level still have a certain intention to obtain, right? Because the predominant intention of both level 2 and level 3 is to obtain, okay? Why obtain? Because since we are not happy, we are not fulfilled, we believe that we can reach happiness by filling ourselves with external things, whether they are relationships or not, toys, as I say, nice houses, cars, fun moments, relationships, sex, whatever, filling ourselves with things from the outside to feel better. Well, it is only at level